$85.4 billion in budget cuts. The sequester begins to hurt those the U.S. Congress does not want to save. But following a series of studies undermining debt-cutting policies, is the idea of austerity running out of currency? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. It was a device that was intended to break the impasse in Congress, a series of draconian and automatic budget cuts that would supposedly push Democrats and Republicans towards making a deal on the budget. But it failed miserably, and now, 2 months on from its activation, the so-called sequester is beginning to hit hard on a whole range of programs reliant on government money. Well, Congress has felt moved to act in some instances and act with uncharacteristic speed, like when the cuts caused large delays at airports due to the enforced leave of air traffic controllers. But Congress has shown no such willingness to offer relief to other people being hammered by the sequester, including cancer patients, long-term unemployed, and those receiving Meals on Wheels. Programs to help victims of domestic violence are also being severely hit. I spoke to Deborah DeBear, the executive director of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I asked her what impact the cuts were having.
Well, you know, we're just now poised and beginning to feel the real impact of the cuts. What's happened here in Rhode Island is in many ways very similar to what's going on in every single city and town, every state and territory in the entire country. Because with the impact of the economy over the past few years, local domestic violence programs have already tightened their belts, and there have already been cutbacks in some services and programs because of a loss of other kinds of funding, whether it's been private foundation funding, state funding, county funding, whatever. So now that we have sequestration cuts coming, it's really like the straw that's just about to break the camel's back. It's just too much for local programs to handle. So here in Rhode Island, for example, we have no choice, but we're actually seeing cutbacks in advocates being available to help victims of domestic violence navigate their way through the court system.
So let's talk about that. I mean,
1st.
What does that actually mean when you say that? Talk to me about the real lives that are being impacted.
Well, you know, every single one of these statistics is a real person. So when I say that there are going to be approximately 1,600 victims of domestic violence that are left without an advocate to help them through court, that's not just a figure, it's not just a number. Those are real individual victims of domestic violence who are going to be in jeopardy and possibly in danger of going back to an abusive situation without having had an advocate help them get a restraining order.
So you're saying that these cuts could actually, in the worst case scenario, cost lives?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to create a false sense of overly dramatic impact, but that's really what we're talking about, because every single victim of domestic violence is living in a dangerous situation. And if she or he can't get help in court with an advocate, or if they can't find a bed in a shelter, or if there isn't someone available to help them do some safety planning, they're really in a very precarious situation.
Talk to me about your reaction to Congress allowing this to happen. You see these real lives that are being affected, are about to be affected. How do you feel about Congress and its inability to manage its finances that has led to this?
Well, you know, I think it's really short-sighted to make these kinds of cuts that are going to have an immediate impact across the board without taking into consideration the real danger that people are facing on a day-to-day basis. You know, the sequestration cuts, coupled with our own state situation here, where we've had a 70% cutback in our state funds for domestic violence programs, is just, it's absolutely outrageous to think that that's what our government is doing. It's basically eroding the safety net for people who need it the most.
Do you think this is something that could be turned around? And if so, what is it that you want to see done?
Well, I mean, absolutely, we need to see some of the funding stabilized and restored to levels where it was before there were cuts. On a state level and on a national level, we need to see the sequestration cuts addressed in a much better way. I understand the fiscal situation that there has to be belt tightening all around, but these across-the-board cuts are hitting the most vulnerable populations at a time where their lives are really in danger.
Do you think those that are being impacted that you work with truly understand the situation and why these cuts are coming into play, and what are they telling you?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of frustration with government when these cuts come down the pike. I think most people don't really understand the why and how it's coming and how it's affecting people on a local level like this. You know, I think if our policymakers really understood that it's their constituents that are in danger, the fact that 1 out of 3 women are going to be victims of domestic violence means it's an epidemic type of situation, and we can't just sweep that under the carpet and say we'll absorb the cuts. We can't absorb any more cuts without eroding this really critical safety net.
Well, joining us now for more, we have James Galbraith, an economist and professor at the University of Texas at Austin. From Denver, David Sirota, a political commentator and New York Times best-selling author. And in our studio here in Washington, we have John Berlau. He is a senior fellow with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a libertarian think tank here in Washington, D.C. David Sirota, I want to start with you. We just heard from Deborah DeBear there talking about some of the cuts to domestic violence programs. Is this an example, in your opinion, of Washington at its worst? We just saw the renewal of the Violence Against Women Act, and then at the same time, we're seeing cuts to programs that act was supposed to help support.
Yeah, I think the sequestration, the whole drama around the sequestration is really a statement of the dysfunction in Washington. That it was a thing that was designed to bring the parties to the table. The assumption was that neither party wanted to see sequestration, and that would be enough to bring the parties to the table. Nobody thought it was an actual way to legislate budget cuts, but because the parties essentially cannot come together, we see across-the-board cuts. Now, here's the thing. My take is, no matter whether you're a conservative, whether you're a liberal, a progressive, whatever you call yourself, the idea of across-the-board cuts, that is non-targeted, just general cuts that haven't been debated, haven't been discussed, haven't put in place in any calculated way, that's not really the way to go forward with any kind of budgeting in a business or in the U.S. Congress and the United States of America. But that's how dysfunctional our country is, where the idea of surgical, calculated, debated cuts are now off the table in favor of just broad cuts without any thinking behind them at all.
James Galbraith, I want to bring you in because we've certainly seen in recent weeks, though, that Congress has been able to restore some programs from these kind of sort of draconian cuts. It restored some tuition funding for military, prevented furloughs for air traffic controllers. Why can some programs be saved and not others?
Well, I think actually that we are seeing developing a very clear strategy, which is to impose across-the-board cuts and then to relax them when there are specific interests which are affected, which happen to be powerful enough to be heard. And that was certainly true in the air traffic situation, but it is obviously not true for victims of domestic violence or for the kids who have been cut off of Head Start or for a great many other programs whose principal function has been to reach out and provide some assistance to some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So I think this is not, in fact, from many people's point of view, an unthought out strategy. I think it's fairly much exactly what they would like to see happen. I think it's deplorable. I think it's highly objectionable. And I would say, you know, the one thing Ms. DeBear said that I really differ with is she made the remark that she understood that there was a need for belt tightening all around. I think this is simply a misapprehension that many people have. There is, under present conditions, no need whatever for belt tightening. We have still 11 million people looking for jobs who can't get them, and many more who would look for jobs if they were available. We need to be quite the opposite approach, to be creative about finding new things, worthwhile things for people to do, rather than thinking that somehow this strategy is going to have a a favorable effect on economic activity, which it won't.
John Berlau, I want to get to you in a moment. First, I want to look at some of the other programs that have been affected by sequester. Now, as we mentioned, Congress successfully staved off flight delays by allowing the FAA to shift its sequester cuts around. But many other programs have not been so lucky. Take a look. Cuts to long-term unemployment benefits. That means that 4.7 million Americans who have been unemployed for more than 6 months will lose up to 10% or $450 in assistance over the next year. 5% cuts to public preschool programs known as Head Start means that 70,000 low-income children will no longer be able to attend them. A 2% cut to Medicare means that doctors and clinics have been forced to deny chemotherapy patients, or rather treatments to patients, and one New York clinic had to turn away more than 5,000 Medicare patients so far. Local Meals on Wheels programs that provide food to low-income seniors have also been slashed. The organization estimates it will be able to serve 19 million fewer meals this year, and disaster relief will be hit hard as well. The Federal Emergency Management Administration's budget will lose $1 billion as the spring storm season approaches. John Berlau, I want to talk to you then. Is this the so-called fat that needs to be trimmed in Washington? I mean, certainly there must be more wasteful spending that could be cut somewhere else.
No, it's not the choice. It's certainly not the choiciest fat that you could cut, and there is plenty of fat that could be cut. The sequester represents about 1% of the federal budget. I think families and businesses and small businesses have been able to cut 1%. Your opening segment showed, and my heart, all our hearts go out to victims of domestic violence, but the opening segment was about Rhode Island supposedly struggling to fund shelters, yet somehow they found $75 million to subsidize a video game company. This is the state government of Rhode Island where the shelter was, of former Major League Baseball player Curt Schilling, who's already a millionaire several times over, and went bankrupt, costing the state $75 million. They may never get that back.
That's a state program, though. We're talking about federal programs
because
right
there
now.
are both. The shelters got state and federal funding. There are examples in the federal government of wasted. Well, I was about to give that of just spending money on businesses like energy companies where the government picks winners and losers. We've also seen some bankruptcies like Solyndra. So I think certainly there is 1%. There is much fat at 1%, including on the defense side, on the foreign policy side, that maybe my progressive colleagues would agree with, where you could find a cut. But we need some mechanism like the sequester to make us deal with it with 1%. And we can. I mean, what happened with air traffic control is showing that it is working. Now, I think it's good when we show, what programs work, what doesn't, and then Congress has to choose between the successful programs and the ones where we can say, maybe these video game company can get money from the private sector, or maybe if the private sector wouldn't subsidize.
Is the problem here that what's happening is the U.S. is being guided by politics? That's what's guiding policy, not actual economic strategy. Maybe, David Sirota, you can weigh in on this. I mean, is that the problem here? Because we've said that this was never intended, that's what's happening?
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said in different ways. I mean, I think, look, the first thing I said was that we need to have a Congress that comes together to decide what its budget is in a targeted, surgical fashion. I agree that corporate subsidies are in many cases a huge waste. I agree that the defense budget needs to be cut. But the fact is that across-the-board cuts are not a surgical way to do that. And I agree with what Jamie said earlier. I think the conservative movement has won a victory here by putting in place across-the-board cuts and essentially putting on autopilot, really an automated version of austerity at exactly the time we don't need it. The conservative movement has an ideological commitment to the notion of austerity, to the notion of, to an anti-government notion, wherever it may be. And so legislating across-the-board cuts, putting them on autopilot and having them now slowly develop over time so that there's not one necessarily dramatic moment, allows that to reset in a way American politics to see this as the new normal. And that's a very, very bad thing for the future.
James Galbraith, what's your thought on that? I mean,
well, I think one thing to bear in mind here is that the reason a Democratic administration agreed to this very damaging procedure, very hurtful procedure, was that they thought it would lead toward a bargain in which they would get reductions, in particular in Social Security, that would be stretched out over a much longer period of time. My view is that's a choice of poisons here. That on the one hand, they are doing, the sequester is doing immediate damage to many people who have really no other recourse, and the chemotherapy patients you mentioned are simply a very vivid example of that. On the other, the reductions in Social Security, some of which were included in the president's proposed budget, including cutting back on cost of living adjustments for some of the what would ultimately be the oldest and poorest of retirees, would also be very harmful. So what we need to do here is to begin to understand that the entire structure of the policy discourse that we've been engaged in has to be changed. We have important problems. We should be addressing them.
John Berlau,
unemployment is a very important problem.
Is this working?
Foreclosures,
are the numbers showing that this across the board sort of draconian cuts, are they working?
Well, I would take issue as to whether a 1% cut is draconian, but certainly I don't think, I think the overall numbers, the stock market hit the Dow Jones Industrial Average hit 15,000 today. The unemployment figures were better. So I don't think, you could say that this 1% cut, I mean, you mentioned the individual instances, and we should fix some of those, but that it's hurting the overall economy, because I don't think government I'm not in the austerity camp. I'm in the growth camp. I don't think government spending creates growth. I think it can take away from private spending, and what you need is to limit government through spending, plus, policies such as tax cuts and regulatory relief.
Well, there have been studies and numbers now that are coming out that would say just the opposite. In fact, in the midst of the global financial crisis, belt-tightening austerity measures were, of course, touted as the only solution for the hardest hit countries. But there is new research that has discredited that thinking, and others suggest the cuts have actually slowed recovery in Europe and in the U.S. Now, economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff wrote, "This Time is Different." It's a book that really became the austerity Bible. In it, they argue that the ratio of public debt to GDP must be kept below 90% to boost growth. But a new study from the University of Massachusetts Amherst found that Reinhart and Rogoff excluded data and made errors in their spreadsheets, incorrectly concluding that cutting public spending helps countries recover. In Europe, years of austerity measures have failed to solve the crisis. In fact, last month, the head of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, warned such policies alone were not sustainable. In Spain and Greece, unemployment has soared to 25%, with 12% out of work in the Eurozone as a whole. And a study by the Brookings Institution here in Washington, D.C., has suggested that austerity in the U.S. has cost 2.2 million people their jobs. James Galbraith will get you to react to that. I mean, are these studies coming out, in fact, then a blow to the austerity theory that that's exactly what the United States needs?
Well, what happened was that Reinhart and Rogoff put out a working paper which made a claim that was preposterous on its face, that there was a kind of magic threshold beyond which, if your public debt was greater than that, your growth would go away. They should have been, and I'm sure now they wish they had been, much more skeptical of that claim, because it's not backed by any plausible economic theory. And it turns out it wasn't backed by the evidence that they had compiled in a spreadsheet either. And had they looked at their data more carefully, they would have seen that that conclusion depended greatly on a single year, 1951, in a single country, New Zealand, which is not exactly representative of the world economy as a whole. So they had a preposterous finding, and they ran with a very badly checked conclusion, and now they're paying, I think, a price for it. More broadly, though, it's obvious to anybody who looks at the situation in Europe that the strategy of cutting budgets and raising taxes, and both sides have been applied with a real vengeance, has produced negative growth year over year in every Mediterranean country out there. In Greece, that's been 6% decline per year for 5 years. The unemployment rate is through the roof. Every public service is collapsing. And a Nazi party is rising very rapidly in the polls. This is the price of imposing austerity policies, and truly draconian ones, on small and defenseless countries.
John Berlau,
so I think that's all very clear. And I agree with John, by the way, that in the U.S. we have not done that. We have had the advantage of big institutions which have stabilized economic activity much more effectively here than in Europe, which is why, while we have very serious troubles, and the sequester is making them worse, our society is not really falling apart in the way in which one sees on the ground in Athens or say, in southern Spain.
Well, John, you point to the fact that the Dow has closed at a record high, which is true, but at the same time, the numbers still show high unemployment, consumer spending is down. Does this mean we should be re-examining these policies?
Well, I am not for the European policy of austerity in terms of cutting spending and raising taxes. I would be cutting spending and cutting taxes like Margaret Thatcher did in Great Britain in the 80s, and Ronald Reagan, or at least holding the line on spending and cutting taxes here, which did produce, I think, dramatic growth, rescued our economies. But other things, we have to look at. There are plenty of things we could do. The U.S. Now has the highest corporate tax rate, higher than we just surpassed. Japan just cut theirs, and we surpassed them. We've got lots of trillions of new regulations from Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, where even with Obamacare, the health care law, the Affordable Care Act, Max Baucus said it might be a train wreck. So those things, not related to spending, the regulatory policies plus the high corporate tax are the things holding us back from growth rather than a 1% cut in the budget, I believe.
So you think that if regulation was not an issue, that things would be just fine? If
not over-regulation to the extent we have now, you need some, and you need protect people from fraud and other things. But we're
I do agree that protecting people from the financial frauds that brought on the Great Crisis would have been a very good idea. Unfortunately, we neither did that before the crisis, nor have we prosecuted the frauds in the aftermath of the crisis. So we have a financial system which is, speaking of dysfunctional, it's beyond dysfunctional.
Well, we also have we also have regulations that Dodd-Frank, some of the things had nothing to do with it. It's forcing companies to label whether they've got metals from the Congo, which may or may not be a good policy, but it's not. It has nothing to do with the banking crisis, and it's just adding an extra.
I'm not aware of that provision in Dodd-Frank.
Well,
let's move forward then. As we look at sort of the overall direction of the country, it's dealing with sequestration right now. David Sirota, maybe you can comment. Do you feel that perhaps because the U.S. is dealing with a policy that was never really intended, that Congress should act in some way to take a second look now that some of this data is out, some of the numbers are out, and there are the real-life European examples?
Well, I certainly think the Congress should take a look at this, and I certainly think the Congress needs to act. But I don't see any realistic chance that it's going to act, at least not yet, because I think, as Jamie put it, the President of the United States has essentially created this choice between Social Security cuts and the sequestration. You've got Democrats in the House and potentially Democrats in the Senate who don't want that. You've also got Republicans in the House and Republicans in the Senate using a record amount of filibusters to stop anything that essentially their Tea Party wing doesn't want. So we are in a serious situation of gridlock. And as I said, as somebody who is left of center, I think that's a particular problem, because ultimately in a gridlock situation with automated across-the-board cuts like sequestration, that's essentially a win for the Republicans. All the right has to do is simply, we're going through, in a sense, a slow-motion government shutdown, if you will. Maybe not the whole government being shut down, but parts of the government at least being shut down or at least curtailed. And gridlock will now keep that going. So that's a big political loss. And one of the things to remember is the difference between now and the mid-90s and how this played out politically. In the mid-90s, there was that dramatic government shutdown, a newsworthy set of moments that the public could, I think, really understand the politics of. Because sequestration is so slow-moving and so gradual over a course of weeks and months and potentially years, there is no necessarily one dramatic moment. So there's not necessarily that political impetus for Congress and the President to get their act together.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Appreciate you joining us. I'm sorry we are out of time. I'm going to have to thank you so much.
Kimberly.
That is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. That is where you can find more information about our program. We always want to hear from you. Share your ideas with us on Twitter. Don't forget our handle is AJ Inside Story AM. Thanks for watching Inside Story America.